Hello everyone, this week we are going to talk about fiscal policy, the Keynesian view, and the historical development of macroeconomics. So first we talk about Great Depression and the macro adjustment process. Let's start with one quote from John Maynard Keynes. He said, "I believe myself to be writing a book on economic theory which will largely revolutionize, not, I suppose, at once, but in the course of the next 10 years, the way the world thinks about economics." And this was written in 1935. So the Great Depression exerted a huge impact on macroeconomics. The national income accounts that we use to measure GDP were developed during this era. Several of the basic concepts of macroeconomics and much of the terminology were initially introduced during the 1930s. Keynesian economics was also an outgrowth of the Great Depression. John Maynard Keynes, as an economist, was the most influential economist of the 20th century. His analysis of the Great Depression altered the views of the economics profession. He even foresaw the impact of his work, as you see in the quote that I showed you in the previous slides. Keynes developed a theory that provided both an explanation for the prolonged unemployment of the 1930s and a recipe for how to generate a recovery. Keynesian analysis indicated that fiscal policy could be used to maintain a high level of output and employment. The Keynesian view dominated macroeconomics for the 3 decades following Second World War. Keynesian economics began to wane during the 1970s because it was unable to explain the simultaneous occurrence of high unemployment and inflation. So just think about, if there is an inflation, the prices are increasing. So it is profitable for firms to produce more goods and services, therefore they hire more labor. But that did not happen in 1970s. There was high inflation and plus high unemployment. But the severe recession of 2008-2009 generated renewed interest in the Keynesian analysis. This week we are going to learn the Keynesian view of fiscal policy and consider how it has evolved through time. And next week we will focus on alternative theories and consider incentive effects that are largely ignored within the Keynesian framework. Taken together, this chapter that you are reading and the next chapter that we will talk about provide a balanced presentation of current views on the potential and limitations of fiscal policy as a stabilization tool. So let's little bit talk about Great Depression. Prior to Great Depression, most economists thought market adjustments would direct an economy back to full employment rather quickly. So what does that mean? That means if there is a recession, that means high unemployment and low demand in the economy, then the inventories are going to pile up and the prices are going to go down. When prices are going down, including the resource prices, firms can easily hire labor because now they are paying lower wages than before. And therefore, demand is going to go back to its previous level because people are finding jobs and then spending more. But the Great Depression's length and severity changed these views. The depth and length of the economic decline during 1930s is difficult to understand. So let's look at some numbers. Between 1929 and 1933, real GDP fell by more than 30%. That's huge. So you are losing 30% of your total output. In 1933, nearly 25% of the US labor force was unemployed. So 1 out of 4 people are unemployed. The depressed conditions continued. In 1939, which is a decade after the plunge began, the rate of unemployment was still 17% and per capita income was virtually the same as a decade earlier. So it is a long period of recession. That's why we call it as depression. After even 10 years, we still have high unemployment and low income. Keynes provided an explanation for the prolonged depressed conditions of the 1930s. He argued that spending motivated firms to produce output. If spending fell, that means there's not enough aggregate demand because people think that the economy is not doing good because of pessimism and other factors. Firms would reduce production. When an economy is in recession, Keynesians do not believe that reductions in either resource prices or interest rates will promote recovery. So as I said before, classical economists think that if there is a recession, then the resource prices are going to go down. That means wages are going to be lower, so their cost is going to go down, and therefore they are still going to be profitable. Or interest rates, lower interest rates is going to make borrowing cheaper, so therefore people are going to borrow money and continue spending if there is a recession. But Keynes is saying that these are not going to happen. As a result, market economies are likely to experience recessions that are both severe and lengthy. In the Keynesian model, firms will produce the amount of goods and services they believe people plan to buy. Equilibrium occurs when total spending equals current output. When this is the case, producers have no reason to expand or contract output. If total spending, which is demand, is deficient, depressed conditions and high levels of unemployment will persist. This is precisely what Keynes believed happened during the 1930s. If total spending is less than full employment output, inventories are going to rise and firms will reduce output and employment. The lower level of output and employment will persist as long as total spending is less than output. Total spending or aggregate demand is key to the Keynesian macroeconomic model. Keynes believed that the cause of the Great Depression is because of the weak aggregate demand or deficient total spending on goods and services. Now, in order to understand how Keynesian policies work, we need to first understand the multiplier principle. So, multiplier principle is the concept that an independent change in expenditures, such as investment or such as consumption or government purchases, leads to an even larger change in aggregate output. The multiplier concept builds on the point that one individual's spending becomes the income of another. Income recipients will spend a portion of their additional earnings on consumption. In turn, their consumption expenditures will generate additional income for others who also spend a portion of it. Thus, growth in spending can expand output by a multiple of the original increase. Let's see this with an example to understand the multiplier process. So here, in the first round, there is an initial spending of $1 million. So let's assume that a grocery store builds a grocery store in a new town and then spends $1 million. And this $1 million becomes an income for other people because constructors are going to get income, landowner is going to get income, and also other things that are used to construct a building will get their income from this investment project. But people don't usually spend all of the income they earn. They save some of it. So let's assume that they are spending only 75% of additional income they receive. So because of that, initial spending of $1 million is going to create here, as you see, $750,000 of new spending. And that $750,000 of new spending is going to be income for different vendors this time. So for instance, constructor's family is going to spend this money to consume in another grocery store, and so on. So this $750,000 becomes an income of the different businesses. These businesses are not going to spend all of it, as you see. Some percentage of it will be consumed, some will be saved. And that round of spending continues until there is no additional spending is created by spending of the income that is received in the previous round. So here, a 1 million injection is spent, received as payment, saved and spent, received as payment, saved and spent, until effectively 4 million is spent in the economy. So what happened here is that $1 million initial spending is actually create $4 million of spending for the economy. The term multiplier is also used to indicate the number by which the initial change in spending is multiplied to obtain the total increase in output. So in the example that we just made, 1 million initial increase in spending expanded output by a total of 4 million. Therefore, here the multiplier was 4. And the size of the multiplier increases with the marginal propensity to consume. So what is marginal propensity to consume? It is what percentage of additional income you spent. So if that percentage increases, let's say it increases from 75% to 90%, that means each additional income you receive, 90% of it you spend, then we see a higher multiplier. Let's do one example to understand this part. Here, in the previous example, 75% of the income was spent. and therefore marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. 75% in decimal form is 0.75. So let's calculate the multiplier using this formula. Multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus 0.75, which is 1 over 0.25, which is 4. Now let's assume the multiplier changed to 90%. So additional income you receive, 90% of it you spend. And therefore, now your marginal propensity to consume is 0.9. If that is the case, multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus 0.9, 1 over 0.1, which is 10. So when you spend more, the more income is generated through initial spending. Therefore, multiplier increases. The multiplier concept also works in reverse. Reductions in spending will also be magnified and generate even larger reductions in income. Even a minor disturbance may be amplified into a major disruption because of the multiplier. And Keynesians argue that the multiplier concept indicates that market economies have a tendency to fluctuate back and forth between excessive demand that generates an economic boom and deficient demand that leads to recession. So, in evaluating the importance of the multiplier, you should remember that an increase in government spending, because we want to stimulate the demand, what we can do is we can increase government spending and give money to people so that they can spend more. Like just think about stimulus checks. But that will require either higher taxes or additional government borrowing, which means you are going to pay higher taxes in the future, because increase in government borrowing is going to have high payments in the future, which is an increase in taxes. This will often generate secondary effects, reducing spending in other areas. And remember that it takes time for the multiplier to work, and the multiplier effect implies the additional spending brings idle resources into production without price changes, which is unlikely to be the case during normal times. During normal times, the demand stimulus effect of additional spending is substantially weaker than the multiplier suggests. According to Keynesian view, fluctuations in total spending are the major source of economic instability. Keynesians believe that market economies have a tendency to fluctuate between economic booms driven by excessive demand and recessions resulting from insufficient demand. And during the recession of 2008-2009, there was an insufficient demand. Therefore, we see a decrease in inflation but high unemployment. The multiplier principle explains why these fluctuations are actually magnified, because an increase in spending has a multiplied impact on the economy, and the same as a decrease in spending has a multiplied impact on the economy. So let's talk about the Keynesian view of fiscal policy. Let's first understand what a budget deficit and budget surplus is. A budget deficit is present when total government spending exceeds total revenue from all sources. When the money supply is constant, deficits must be covered with borrowing. The US Treasury borrows by issuing bonds. So in case of a deficit, government spends more than its revenue, and government can do it by borrowing money. A budget surplus is present when total government spending is less than total revenue. Surpluses reduce the magnitude of the government's outstanding debt. Changes in the size of the federal deficit or surplus are often used to gauge whether fiscal policy is stimulating or restraining the demand. Changes in the size of budget deficit or surplus may arise from either a change in the cyclical economic conditions or a change in the discretionary fiscal policy. And the federal budget is the primary tool of fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is the government tools that government uses to stimulate aggregate demand or to reduce aggregate demand. So there are two tools. Government can increase purchase or decrease purchase, and government can increase tax and decrease tax. What is discretionary changes in fiscal policy? These are the deliberate changes in government spending and or taxes designed to affect the size of the budget surplus or budget deficit. Fiscal policy and the good news of Keynesian economics. So Keynesian theory highlights the potential of fiscal policy as a tool capable of reducing fluctuations in aggregate demand. Prior to Great Depression, most believed that the government should balance its budget. Government should not run a deficit or a surplus. Keynesian changed this view, and they said that rather than balancing the budget annually, Keynesian argue counter-cyclical policy, which is used to offset fluctuations in aggregate demand. So when the economy is weak, then the government should target for a budget deficit, because government should increase the spending to stimulate the aggregate demand. And when the economy is strong, then government should decrease its spending and should have budget surplus, because that strong demand threatens to cause inflation. When an economy is operating below its potential output, the Keynesian economic model suggests that fiscal policy should be more expansionary, increase spending or decrease taxes. Let's see this example. This is an example of an expansionary fiscal policy. So the economy is at first E1, that means the economy is below its potential, right? And there are two routes to long-run full employment equilibrium. You can rely on lower resource prices, that means you pay lower wages than before, and that reduces costs and increase supply to here, from SRAS1 to SRAS2. Lower prices, lower the cost of production, therefore increases supply. But this has a problem, right? Nobody is going to accept wages lower than what they get before. Usually wages are sticky. An alternative way is expansionary fiscal policy. In that case, you are here and you increase the government spending or reduce the taxes. So therefore, aggregate demand is actually shifts to the right here from AD1 to AD2. So when that happens, the new equilibrium in the economy is E2 and the economy goes back to its full employment level. So Keynesians believe that allowing the market to self-adjust may be a lengthy and painful process. Expansionary fiscal policy stimulates demand and directs the economy to full employment level. When inflation is a potential problem, then Keynesian analysis suggests fiscal policy should be more restrictive, which means reduction in government spending or increase in taxes. Let's see one example. Let's assume there is strong demand, such as in AD1, will temporarily lead to an output rate beyond the economy's long-run potential. Here is that, right? You are here, more than potential. If maintained, the strong demand will lead to the long-run equilibrium E3 at higher price levels. So what happens is that because of the strong demand, the prices are going to increase and wages are priced too. Wage rates are going to increase. The production becomes more costly. Therefore, as you see here, short-run supply curve shifts backward. And then we reach to E3. That is self-adjustment. But Keynesians say that this is not going to happen easily, self-adjustment. Don't let the economy solve its problems on its own. Instead, the government here intervenes the economy and increases the tax rates, for instance. When tax rates are higher, people spend less, or reduces its spending, therefore aggregate demand curve shifts backward. And because of that, the new equilibrium is going to be here. Existing short run plus new demand curve. So restrictive fiscal policy restrains demand and helps control inflation. So let's make a summary. The federal budget is the primary tool of fiscal policy. Keynesians stress the importance of counter-cyclical policy. That means the budget should shift toward deficit when the economy is threatened by recession, and the budget should shift toward surplus when inflation is a threat. So let's now talk about fiscal policy changes and problems of timing. There are three major reasons why it's difficult to time fiscal policy changes in a manner that promotes stability. First of all, it takes time to institute a legislative change, and there is a time lag between when a change is instituted and when it exerts significant impact. These time lags imply that sound policy requires knowledge of economic conditions 9 to 18 months in the future, but our ability to forecast future conditions is limited. Discretionary fiscal policy is like a two-edged sword. It can both harm and help. If timed correctly, it may reduce economic instability, but if timed incorrectly, however, it may increase economic instability. So in order to prevent this timing problem, we have automatic stabilizers. Without any new legislative action, these tools will increase the budget deficit or reduce the surplus during a recession and increase the surplus or reduce the deficit during an economic boom. So what happens, for instance, if there is a recession, unemployment insurance benefits are increasing automatically or social security payments are increasing automatically. The major advantage of automatic stabilizer is that they institute counter-cyclical fiscal policy without the delays associated with legislative action. Examples of automatic stabilizers: unemployment compensation, corporate profit tax, and progressive income tax. Saving, spending, debt, and the impact of fiscal policy. So, Keynesians talk about a paradox of thrift. This is the idea that when a large number of households increase their saving and reduce consumption, their actions may reduce aggregate consumption and throw the economy into recession. Keynesians often stress the dangers implied by the paradox of thrift and excessive saving. The paradox of thrift indicates that efforts to save more could reduce the overall demand for goods and services, causing businesses to reduce output and lay off workers. So, there is also a paradox of excessive consumption. While an increase in consumption might temporarily stimulate aggregate demand, households will face financial troubles if they save little and spend most of what they earn and borrow on current consumption. Even though the incomes of Americans are the highest in history, so too is their financial anxiety. You cannot have a strong and healthy economy when households are heavily indebted and face persistent financial troubles because their saving rate is low. So you see on the screen household debt as a share of after-tax income between 1960 and 2015. The household debt to income ratio of Americans has increased steadily since the mid-1980s. The debt to disposable income ratio of households soared to 130% in 2007, approximately twice the level of the 1960s and 1970s. During the years following the Great Recession, household debt declined as a share of after-tax income. Household debt and the 2008-2009 recession. The historically high level of debt meant households were in a weak position to deal with the recession of 2008-2009. As a result of their high debt-income ratio, households were reluctant to spend additional income. Thus, the Keynesian tax rebates and federal spending increases of the Bush and Obama administrations were largely ineffective because people were just paying back off their debt. Even with the budget deficit of 10% of GDP, output was sluggish and unemployment remained high in 2009-2012. So this is the end of chapter 11. Thank you.